Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the training style from the era of guys like Steve Reeves and Leroy Colbert, and how these guys approached training. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, do a little bit of crafting, and let's talk about this. Alright, some things these guys had in common that we don't always see today, but it produced pretty much amazing both bodies aesthetically as well as strength-wise from their era. A lot of these guys from all through the 50s, the training, they were big and strong. They did so without access to all the drugs and things that people have today. Now, a lot of people will argue, well, their training methods sucked and we have better methods today. Well, we have better methods of training for sport-specific reasons due to years and years and decades of exercise science. But bodybuilding training hasn't evolved. If anything, many in the competitive bodybuilding type world or subculture, their training for people who aren't on hefty doses of drugs has become inferior to what these guys used. And it actually hasn't evolved as much as people seem to think it has. It really hasn't, unfortunately. So how is it that these guys trained? What sort of methods did they use? What was really common? Well, the things they had in common, they tended to do full body training 3 days a week or every other day. Steve Reeves utilized Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Full body training. Leroy Colbert utilized every other day. So he would have 3 times a week training, 1 week and 4 times the next. So he had 48 hours between workouts. Now what's interesting to note that they did that because they trained their whole body. They didn't have an arm day, a leg day. They didn't have an upper-lower split. When they came in and trained, they came in and trained their whole body. And it worked very, very well for them. A lot of people will say things like, well, that's only for noob lifters, blah, blah, blah. And I think what people need to remember, when we start talking in most people's terms of changing to split type training, it's not about noob versus advanced. It's more about natural versus going on drugs. All right, that's actually code word in the bodybuilding world. Becoming more advanced in that world is code for upping your motherfucking dose. That's what that means. And people are misinterpreting it because they're using a little bit of code there because they don't want to admit that's what it's about. Now, in their era, that's how they did it. And the reason that's so successful is because muscles only grow up to 48 hours after you train them. Meaning, if they're coming in and they're training approximately every 48 hours, I mean, there's a 72-hour gap in Steve Reeves' training, but it certainly didn't hinder him in any way. He had 1 day a week where he wasn't growing. Leroy Colbert did it full time, meaning every 48 hours he was back in the gym. That's how these guys trained, and it was full body. They came in and they trained the entire body, because if they didn't, they would have muscles that lagged. Why? Because you'd have muscles that weren't being trained as frequently as they needed to re-stimulate growth. So you would always have something growing slower than the others if you didn't train it at least 3 times a week. And it wasn't hard for these guys to figure this out. Furthermore, they realized that being stronger was useful. They believed in form following function. They didn't believe that you could just look good and not be able to perform, or vice versa. They believed that you should be able to perform well and that your body would follow suit. That if you made muscles stronger and exercises stronger, the muscles would get bigger and follow suit. And they had methods of just focusing more on one if they needed something to grow a little faster, and we'll get into that in a minute of how they would balance things back out. They didn't do it by doing split days. Now, that being said, that's how they did it. And because they trained the whole body every time they trained it to perform as one unit. Well, that's important for overall strength, athleticism, things like that. Meaning, there are plenty of bodybuilders out there, guys, that say, why are some of these bodybuilders so weak? Well, some are and some aren't, but I can tell you this much. If they've trained everything and isolated all these muscles and built everything up, if they don't have any weak links, they might be fairly weak compared to a powerlifter or strength athlete when you start. But if you were to put them on a proper program where they learn to use the whole body together, in 3, 4, 5, 6 months, they would be brutally strong. They would be strong pound for pound like a power lifter at that point, once you trained all those muscles to work together. These guys chose to just learn to use their bodies together at one time. They would come in and they would do a lot of big, heavy barbell movements, full body movements, squats, deadlift, push presses, clean and presses. Even Arnold was big on all those things, if people weren't aware of that. They came in and did big, full body movements. And then they would come in and do isolation movements. But they generally trained the way that most physiology texts would have you train. You start with the biggest muscles and biggest exercises first and work your way down with those. And that's how they did it. They would start with the big exercises, deadlifts, squats, things like that, work their way down to the smaller muscles. Why? Because it requires more energy to do the big exercises. And if you do smaller exercises first, it can impede your progress on the big stuff that hits the most muscles. But doing the smaller ones later impedes their performance less. Meaning, doing an overhead press before a deadlift will impede your deadlift sometimes, but doing it after a deadlift won't impede your overhead press significantly most of the time. Now, it might if you took the deadlift to failure. Or a squat. Let's use a squat instead of a deadlift. That's the idea. So when you do kind of bottom-up lifts, like the biggest muscles get worked first, biggest exercises hit the most muscles first, and then work your way down, you usually get better overall workloads for the training session, better tonnage, and everything gets worked better. Now, the way they would deal with it is if they had a muscle that was growing a little slower or that they wanted to prioritize, modern guys today are like, well, you just need a separate day for it. No, because think about that. It still only gets 48 hours of growth time. That really helping it? You're giving it a little extra growth that might be overlapping with your other growth? No, why don't you just train it more? And they had two methods of doing that. Leroy Colbert decided he wanted really big biceps. He wanted the biggest biceps in the world. He still trained full body, so how did he address that? He doubled the amount of sets he did for his biceps. And they started growing faster again because they had stalled. And he ended up with enormous arms for his era. Enormous arms. But that's because he was doing, instead of 3 sets of curls every workout for 9 sets a week, he stepped it up to 6. And he did 18 sets for biceps every week. And it worked. After doing that for several years, they grew enormously because he was doing that 3 times a week. He just doubled his workload to increase the growth on that muscle, and that was his approach. Because the guys at that time, both of those guys were really big on doing sets of 10. Now, most of us will argue about rep ranges and volume all day long, but 3 sets of 10, even today, is recognized as a very, very effective hypertrophy protocol. It has just enough intensity and just enough workload to stimulate nearly maximum growth. The only issue is progression. So how did these guys progress? When they could add weight with good form, they added weight. They just did 3 sets of 10 until they got stronger with it. When they could add weight, they would add weight. Some of them would use the other approaches I discussed where they would add weight and then drop reps and slowly add reps as they were able to with the new weight. Sometimes they would just wait till they got stronger, and they could do 3 sets of 10 with 225 on the bench press. They would do that, and if it started getting easier, they'd add 5 pounds. Go to 230, and when they could do 3 sets of 10 with 230, they'd add another 5 pounds. Pretty straightforward. And that's how they approached it. But as far as the weak point training, Leroy Colbert just doubled his sets, and it worked. Steve Reeves, he was a big fan of the incline curl, for example. That was his favorite bicep exercise. What he would do, like many of these guys would do if they would start to get imbalanced, because many guys complain about that, like, well, my legs get too big when I squat first, and my arms seem to lag or whatever. His approach to that, because he felt he needed more bicep to have the proportions that he wanted, he used to curl at the start of every session. And you can get away with it because the biceps are a very small muscle. They don't take much energy to train. So by doing curls first, he didn't hurt his squats, deadlifts, push presses, overhead presses, any of that stuff. He didn't hurt his big movements because it's such a small muscle that wasn't particularly involved in anything other than the row, the chin-up, stuff like that. It didn't hurt him to train it first as far as the progression on the big lifts. So that's how he approached it. He came in and he did curls, incline curls, I believe, at the start of every workout. Then he would go to his squats, his deadlifts, all of that stuff. And that was his approach to specializing on a muscle. And that's how these guys did it. They didn't do separate days. They just trained everything 3 days a week. And if a muscle needed more priority, they just added more work for it. They trained it more. Or they would prioritize it by moving it to the front of the workout, meaning if you started having imbalances, normally you'll get fairly balanced growth if you just do biggest exercises to the smallest, but if they had something they particularly wanted to focus on, they would just do it first. That way it got the most energy and the best workloads, and then they would go into the rest of their workout. And maybe they would do another exercise for it later in the workout. And, you know, that was the whole idea, is that even if he wanted to do chin-ups, he would do incline curls, but because he spent 45 minutes doing other exercises, his biceps had probably recovered enough from the curls for him to come behind and do his chin-ups anyways later. It's just that doing them immediately after would have been a problem. So that's how they approached weak point training, and you know what? All these guys were successful. All these guys were successful at what they did. And they didn't use any sort of convoluted splits. They didn't use any complex styles of training, and yet they were all big, they were all strong. And they did so with either no or very, very minimal amounts of drugs compared to what even many so-called daddies today use. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.